So before we start, I just want to let you all know that we are new to video editing and most of our slides did not make it into the final recording. So we posted the link here. We're also going to put it in the chat, and just in case we're not able to figure this out by the time the presentation actually happens, I've also posted like super quick visions of our slides just in case we're not able to get it into the final thing. If you have any trouble or you want to see our slides, please don't hesitate to contact us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our session. I am so thrilled to be here, and big thanks to Southern Harm Reduction Coalition as well. I just want to go over what this presentation is going to be all about and just kind of set the expectations. So we're going to talk initially about what harm reduction is, the various intersections of harm reduction that come into play when we're talking about substance use, pregnancy, being a person with a uterus, and really, like, why should we care about this topic, and do we actually care about this topic? Then we're going to kind of talk about a little bit of the dry science-y stuff about 6 different classes of substances and what their effects are, if any, on pregnant people and pregnancy outcomes. So we're going to go over alcohol, benzodiazepines, cannabis, opioids, stimulants, and tobacco. Primarily, we're going to be talking about smoking cigarettes. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about what doula services are, and especially what doula services are in the context of harm reduction and birth. And then we're going to kind of give you some tools and tips to start doing doula work now, because it really is, the exciting thing about doula work is that anybody can start providing services, because it really is just support. And then we hope that we'll pique your interest and you'll be interested in enrolling or entering our drawing that we're going to be doing for a full spectrum doula training course from Cornerstone Doula Trainings. And that drawing we'll give you some details about that at the end. So thanks again so much for coming. So before we dive in, we just want to do really brief introductions of the three of us. I'm Joelle. I'm a nurse. I've been working in perinatal care and harm reduction for a really long time, and I'm just really excited to be here with everybody. Our other presenters are Ria Tsinas, or Ria. Ria and I have known each other for over a decade. We started working together at the People's Harm Reduction Alliance in Seattle, or PRA as we call it. And we talk about PRA a lot throughout, so that's what we're talking about, People's Harm Reduction Alliance in Seattle. That's where Ria and I met, and where our third presenter, Chelsie, currently works. So Chelsie Porter is our third presenter, and Chelsie is a full-spectrum doula that works in with populations that use substances in Seattle, Washington. They also work for the People's Harm Reduction Alliance. So if folks are interested in getting started with providing more reproductive services in their syringe access programs or other harm reduction programs, on our website, or possibly included in conference handouts at the time of recording, we weren't sure how it was actually going to work. There are going to be several posters, infographics, tons of information and flyers for organizations that want to start creating more welcoming spaces for pregnant people in their services. And that can be important for the pregnant people themselves, but also just as kind of priming your community, because it's not necessarily or always the staff of the program that that pregnant people fear knowing that they're pregnant. It could be other folks in the other participants in the community. So it's really important to make sure that it is visible and everybody knows that your location is a good place for pregnant people to come and seek, whatever they need. So feel free to download any of those.
Well, I mean, I want to say this too. It's like if harm reduction is the practice of radical love, then then we people by far, people who are accessing services in harm reduction spaces have are people who have experienced a lot of trauma and have really no understanding of what it means to be loved radically in that way, or how to love something else, like in that sense. And so we have this like really amazing opportunity to like love people and surprise them, like, because people I think are expecting to be pushed further, even more marginalized.
All right. So, Ria, can you talk a little bit about why this matters and why we should be integrating, or whether we should be integrating reproductive services into harm reduction spaces like syringe service programs?
Well, I think that the two are sort of, people who are accessing services are people who are of reproductive age. But people also take drugs, and then a lot of times they have sex. I know it's crazy, but it's true. And so, it's really interesting. Lots of people don't get like appropriate or proper sex education. Like, when we were doing Women's Day at PRA, we did like trivia, and it was really interesting. Or even here, where I work here in Portland, I did a reproductive health board, and it was really interesting to hear people's ideas around just like anatomy, and like how their bodies work. One thing that's really common that happens to people who have the capacity to be pregnant that are opiate users is oftentimes they'll become amenorrheic, and there's this like very common myth or misconception that just because you stop having your period, that means that you can not become pregnant, which is actually just not true. So, and we're talking about reducing harm. And so, when people are accessing services within the capacity of drug use, we know that harm reduction services are a great place. More people are, I think it's 3 times more likely to get into treatment or medication assisted treatment than their counterparts who aren't accessing harm reduction services on a regular basis. And so we have very strong data to support the fact that almost all pregnant people decrease or stop their substance use when they find out that they're pregnant. And so when they're coming into harm reduction spaces and they have that those resources readily available to them, and they also know that they can feel safe and not judged because they're walking into an environment where people are educated and knowledgeable about the impacts of substances on their pregnancies, is really powerful. I mean, because the drug wars, it operates to create and perpetuate trauma and inflict trauma and separate families and sort of have this revolving wheel. And if we can include services that educate people about what's happening with their bodies, reduce rates of recidivism into criminal justice, then we're reducing harm in that sense at the very start. And just being able to provide people with common sense education about substances and how they impact people's bodies. And we do have a lot of evidence that suggests really strong risks for harm that are the most commonly used substances during pregnancy, which is alcohol, cigarette smoking, and caffeine. And those two, alcohol and smoking, are the two substances with the strongest risk for harm.
So before we get started on what the data says, I want to talk a little bit about what knowledge is and how it's created and how that impacts what information we have access to and the truthfulness and completeness of that information. So anytime that we're studying somebody who is doing something that they will be punished, stigmatized, and harassed for, we have to pay attention to what percentage of the population are we actually able to look at. So when we're looking at people who use drugs during pregnancy and parenting, study samples are not at all representative of the general population. We are able to study people who get caught. Now, people who get caught tend to have more surveillance in their lives. They tend to have more oppressive systems that they have to interact with, and so they end up being primarily marginalized populations. So we're looking at people with less money, people who are Black or Indigenous or other folks of color. We're looking at people who are unmarried, young, atypical ability, the full LGBTQIA spectrum. We're looking at people whose families don't look the way that, the traditional family that we're taught about in all the textbooks is going to look. We also see a much higher proportion of folks who have the stress on their lives of the experience of racism and who are caught up in these systems of control already. So that's like the criminal justice system, the family regulation and surveillance systems that we have in place. So all of these things apply pressure on this family that is completely independent of their substance use. But oftentimes, if we're looking at this information about these families, researchers just love to kind of blame everything, the whole thing, on substance use, when if we compare a family who has this level of oppression and harassment in their life and uses the drug to a family who has the same level of harassment and oppression in their life, we're really not seeing very different outcomes a lot of the times. So what ends up happening is, because these researchers are frankly lazy and already have an idea of what they want their outcomes to be, we end up with this kind of incomplete picture and just really poor interpretation of what that picture actually means for people. We also have the issue that, academia and information is business, and studies need funding. And most of the funding in this country for studies about substance use, whether in pregnancy or not, comes from the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. And it says it right there in the name. They are not interested in looking for just undiluted facts. They are looking for negative effects associated with substances. And there are several research projects that I know of that have struggled to find funding simply because they're either not focused on the negative, or they didn't find the negative, even if that was what they were looking for when they started out. And really, all of our funders and thought leaders in this area are coming at it from a perspective not necessarily of science and trying to find out what the truth is so that we can help people live their best lives and have their best outcomes. But all of these organizations are focused on the negative effects of substances, or quite frankly, the made-up negative effects of substances. And so it ends up being just really hard to read the science and the research. So a lot of what I'm going to say in the following slides, you'll notice, is quite different from what you've heard in other places, and even really highly respected places. And I don't want to add at all to the mistrust of science that pervades our culture, especially right now, because the science is there, and you can read it and figure out what it says. It ends up being like a game of telephone, where this researcher will find kind of, a non-result, like both groups did pretty much the same. But they will interpret that as saying, well, we didn't find it, but it's probably there, so we need to be very careful. And then the next researcher will say, well, they said that it was bad. And then the next researcher and the next researcher. And by the time it gets to one of those thought leaders who's creating a position statements that are really going to drive policy, the risk has been exaggerated over and over until it turns into this big monster. And don't even get me started on the regular media when they're interpreting this stuff. So for most of what I do, I don't look at meta-analyses or big studies that kind of try to smush a bunch of little studies together. I go back and I look at each one of the little studies. So what I'm trying to tell you is actually raw, hard data and not stuff that's been interpreted to death. So I just want to give one brief example of what ends up happening when we live in a research climate like this. This is a real quote from a paper put out by the Academy, by, what are they? AAP. They're the American Academy of Pediatrics. And this is from one of their most widely cited and most respected papers by Benke and Smith. It came out in 2013. And they say, they're talking about risk factors for harm to a pregnancy or a newborn. And they're talking about risk for harm to a pregnancy or to the newborn. And here's what they say. These altered behaviors, which include poor nutrition, decreased access to or compliance with health care, increased exposure to violence, and increased risk of mental illness and infection, may place the fetus at risk. And I want to think for a moment with you about how many committees this phrase had to get through to reach publication. How many people looked at this and read this and said, yep, decreased access to health care is certainly a behavior. You should stop doing that. Increased risk of mental illness, increased exposure to violence. Why don't you just stop doing that if it's a behavior? And this is the attitude and just the level of ignorance and laziness that pervades both research and policy direction in this area. And that is what we're fighting against. So now we'll get to the actual data. So most of you probably are aware that alcohol is the most commonly used substance during pregnancy. I know so many people who are not considered to be people who use substances will have some amount of alcohol and consider that to be okay during their pregnancy. In fact, my own sisters were not aware that there's no safe level of alcohol during pregnancy until I told them. So this is something that not only has a lot of, it's not stigmatized like other substance use during pregnancy, but it also is something that the healthcare system is not doing a great job letting people know about. Because even people, like my white middle-class sisters who had full prenatal care with excellent physicians, they didn't get adequate training about, what the actual risks were during pregnancy. So we know with alcohol there's risk of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which you may have heard of. Fetal alcohol syndrome was the old term that we used to use for that. And the prevalence in the United States is actually estimated to be at about 2 to 5% of all births. So this is by far the most commonly used substance during pregnancy. And I hear a lot of times folks will be like, oh, well, my cousin lives in France and they just drink during pregnancy like it's no big deal. And I'll tell you that estimates of European populations are closer to 10%. So it's kind of funky because it's a spectrum, So a lot of kids, have just very minor effects, and it's often very difficult to tell, was this going to happen anyway? Because, there's a certain percentage of children that will be born with, dyslexia or behavior problems or learning disabilities, and it's really hard to pin down, is it because of alcohol or is this just something that would have happened? So especially with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it's tough because it doesn't seem to be dose dependent. Sometimes people with very high levels of exposure will have no effects, and sometimes people with very low levels of exposure will have effects. So it can be really tricky. Other than newborn outcomes, the other things to watch out for with alcohol exposure is increased risk of miscarriage and stillbirth and impaired placenta function. And so just as a refresher about pregnancy, the placenta is a brand new organ that forms with every pregnancy. It's kind of the in-between for the pregnant person and the fetus. So the pregnant person's blood fills up the placenta, and then the fetal blood fills up the other side. And then there's very thin barriers where nutrients can pass across to the fetus and toxins can be taken away to the pregnant person to be processed by their liver and kidneys. So if we have impaired placental function, that means that either or both things can happen. Either the fetus will not be receiving adequate nutrition or will be receiving, altered levels of what they should be, or their toxins may not be processed in a timely fashion. So with alcohol, we have really strong data of a lot of effects, and some of those effects, such as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, can be permanent. So what do we not know about alcohol? So much. For being one of the most heavily studied and reported on substances, we really don't know a lot. For example, why do some heavily exposed kids have no effects and lightly exposed kids have stronger effects? To my mind, there is something else involved. It's perhaps stress or environmental contaminants or something that interacts with the alcohol, or it's possible that there is a particular time when alcohol exposure is when people are most vulnerable to alcohol exposure. We don't have any of that data. That would be really handy, but we just don't know, and we don't know why some kids have effects and some kids don't. Benzodiazepines are a fun one because there's very little research on benzodiazepine use outside of prescription. And as you know, as everyone who uses drugs or knows people who use drugs is aware, benzodiazepines are really commonly used alongside of a lot of the substances that we see frequently. Benzodiazepines can enhance the effects of downers like opioids. And they can also give folks who maybe have been on a run for several days with stimulants like cocaine or methamphetamine, they can give them a break, knock them out, and let them sleep. So we know that these are used quite frequently in a non-prescription fashion, but we really don't have too much data on that. So most of the data that I'm going to be talking about is coming from people who were prescribed benzodiazepines during pregnancy for anxiety or sleep disturbances or something of that nature. So we have some kind of tenuous data that suggests that there may be possible congenital malformations, particularly cleft lip or cleft palate. But even if the data were more robust, it's still a difference of a fraction of a percentage point in increased risk. So pretty minor as far as risk profiles go for substances. We also see the possibility of neonatal withdrawal. Typically with prescribed use, we don't see a whole lot of neonatal withdrawal, which could mean that it's not there, or it could mean that it's just so mild that we don't require any increased interventions. Like maybe your baby just cries a little bit more than other babies or something like that. But it doesn't seem to be distressing to the point where it requires extra attention. So one of the most intriguing questions about research around benzos in pregnancy is, are the effects that we're seeing from these prescription studies related to the substances themselves, or are they related to sleep disturbances? Because we also have data that shows that if you struggle with insomnia or nightmares or any kind of sleep disturbance during pregnancy, we see some of these similar effects that on the previous slide we were talking about may be associated with benzodiazepine use. So it's really another one of those questions when you're in research that's really hard to tweak out. Is this related are the possible and very subtle effects that we might be seeing, are they related to the substance use themselves, or are they related to the reason people are using substances in the first place? And that will just be a recurring theme throughout this whole time. Another thing I'm really interested in is why there is such a lack of research on unprescribed benzodiazepine use. Because the patterns of use for people who are prescribed tend to be either, they'll use it for a few days for an anxiety flare-up or something like that, or it's constant use. And then what we see with people who are using other illicit substances is that it will be kind of spikes and dips more than those kind of more controlled and planned use. So it'll be a lot all at once to help you come down from meth and fall asleep, or it'll be, here and there whenever you can get it to assist with your opioid use disorder. One other thing that I want to mention real quick about benzodiazepines is that the withdrawal from these substances, if you're using it consistently and over a long period of time, is very similar to withdrawal from alcohol, which can be fatal and is very dangerous. So if you find yourself with a benzodiazepine or with an alcohol dependence physically, it's really important to taper down slowly and not try to go cold turkey, because that could be really dangerous, even if you're not pregnant. So for cannabis, please give us a call. I will give you a 20-hour presentation about cannabis, and most of it will be, we looked for this, we didn't find it. We looked for this, we didn't find it. There's no strong evidence of any severe long-term harm from perinatal cannabis exposure. So that means either during pregnancy or via breast milk or human milk in the postpartum period. You'll find a lot of people claiming things out there. So they'll say cannabis will make your baby not do so well in school, or is associated with increased risk of behavior problems. And when you really dig down and look at those original studies, what we find is that at various points in their lives, these children that were followed, for decades following cannabis exposure, say at 2 years old, and I'm pulling this off the top of my head, at 2 years old, they scored, 3 points lower than other kids on a mental test. And then at 4 years old, they scored 5 points higher than other kids on a mental test. And so what we're seeing is that all of the results from these studies, I would say perhaps not every study, but most of these studies are finding that kids who are exposed to cannabis and kids who are not exposed to cannabis perform very similarly. Sometimes one's ahead, sometimes the other's ahead. But there really is there are no results that are outside the range of normal. So let's say maybe when you're 2 years old, if you're exposed to cannabis, you're more likely to get an A- versus an A if you were unexposed. And then when you're 4 years old, it's flipped. So it's a lot of data collection, and trust me, it's a lot. We've been looking for problems caused by cannabis exposure for such a long time, and we're just not finding it. All of these kids are within the normal range, and we're not finding anything. And these are some of the studies that get the worst misinterpretations, both by the authors of the study themselves and then down the road as we play that game of telephone. So one thing that is really interesting about cannabis studies, or maybe less interesting, but we find that when we study affluent populations who are exposed to cannabis, they tend to do better than their unexposed counterparts, especially in places and cultures where cannabis use is associated with affluence. For example, in Jamaica, if you're able to use cannabis regularly, that means you can afford to use cannabis regularly. So that comes along with all kinds of things like a more enriched home environment, more adults in the home, more speaking to the child, more reading to the child. And so for those populations, we see higher, better outcomes associated with cannabis exposure. And again, I am not suggesting that cannabis makes your baby smarter. I am suggesting that what we're studying is not cannabis, but is in fact sociodemographic status. Because when we study, poor, less educated, marginalized communities with cannabis exposure, who, by the way, we're studying because they got caught, excuse me, we see slightly decreased scores on some of these tests. And so really, particularly with cannabis, but to an extent with every drug, when we're studying these populations, it is vital to compare groups that are equal on all measures. And we don't have that. When we catch people and study them, they're automatically going to be subjected to that extra stress that comes with getting caught. And so it's really difficult to separate out what is associated or caused by the drug and what is just part of being stressed out and harassed and oppressed and marginalized. And we see that particularly with cannabis studies. So for opioids, probably most of you are aware that the most talked about side effect on pregnancy outcomes is neonatal opioid withdrawal. This is a temporary and treatable condition. With good care, we can keep babies very comfortable and keep them from experiencing any of the, the more serious side effects that come with untreated or poorly treated withdrawal. We also know that it doesn't appear to be dose dependent. Now, I think that it is possible and even probable that there is a dose-dependent element, but what we see when we look at large groups of folks and we compare people, say, on 200 milligrams of methadone versus those on, like 16 milligrams of buprenorphine or Suboxone or Subutex, what we see is that their dose does not necessarily predict the severity of withdrawal or the length of treatment requirement. Now, these studies are just, there's just a whole mess with these because we know that non-pharmacological treatments such as holding, breast or chest feeding, being with the parents, being in a dark room, not in a NICU, we know that all of these things affect both the severity of symptoms and the length of treatment requirement. So when we're looking at studies comparing different populations from different hospitals with different practices of how they treat, it's really, really difficult to find good data from that kind of data collection, just because there are so many variables and they're really important ones. And so it can be tricky to find a dose dependence. But at the same time, we haven't, and there have been lots of studies that have looked for that. So what I want you to take away from that is when you're counseling your clients, most people, when they become pregnant, they think, oh, I've got to stop methadone. I've got to get off methadone. I've got to decrease my dose. No. What is most important, based on the research that we have, is that the pregnant person is stable. They're not experiencing undue distress. They're not experiencing over-sedation from too high a dose, or they're not experiencing withdrawal, because that can be harmful to a pregnancy and a fetus. The most important thing is that person's stability and that person's recovery. And I think that it's also kind of transformative and even magical to tell someone who's pregnant, no, you matter. We need to focus on what makes you feel good and safe and confident. And that, I think, is one of the most beautiful things that we can do for folks. You'll also see a lot of people claiming that long-term outcomes are poor for kids who have neonatal withdrawal. And there's, again, just so many confounding factors that go into some of that data. So what we see is that folks who are born to marginalized people in neighborhoods where maybe it's a food desert and you can't get proper nutrition and you're exposed to violence, they have kind of similar lives to their parents most of the time. I mean, it seems like it ought to be a no-brainer. And so they have similar outcomes to their parents. What we see is that kids from the same neighborhoods who maybe have been exposed to opioids and one hasn't, they have similar outcomes. So yes, people who are born into families that are oppressed and harassed and marginalized have similar lives to their parents who were harassed and oppressed and marginalized. But it's not about the drug. And so that kind of puts the responsibility on us as communities to support folks who are struggling and take people out of marginalized situations and make sure that we don't have kids growing up in food deserts and children aren't seeing people shot in their front yard. And it forces us to, instead of just saying, oh, you're bad because of drugs, it forces us to say, we're bad because we let this happen to you. And that's a realization that a lot of folks don't want to come to. So again, as similarly with alcohol, why are the effects not predictable and dose dependent? I think again that there are probably multiple other factors that go into why some kids have severe withdrawal and why some kids, you know, fuss a little bit extra for a few days and then go home happy. We just don't know. So when we talk about stimulants, there are just, you know, hundreds, probably thousands of stimulant substances in the world. I'm particularly talking about the ones that are used without a prescription in the United States mostly. So basically we're talking about cocaine, methamphetamine, and caffeine. And people are often surprised that I include caffeine in this group. And while it does act on different receptors and through different pathways in the brain, the results are very similar. We see increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, wakefulness, increased productivity, feelings of euphoria with all three of these stimulants, even though that they all work slightly differently. We also see similar pregnancy outcomes. So with increased blood pressure, there's a whole constellation of stuff about pregnancy and blood pressure that we won't get into. But we see really similar things. So one of the most commonly associated effects of high blood pressure in pregnancy is decreased birth weight and slightly shorter gestation, which means born before the due date. Gestation is the length of time that you're pregnant. And I put a few citations on the slide. There are lots more. This is pretty much an established association that we see in most of the literature. However, we're not talking about the difference between 8 pounds and 4 pounds. We're talking about the difference between, you know, 7 pounds 8 and 7 pounds 12. We're talking about the difference between, you know, 38 weeks and 5 days pregnant or 39 weeks and 2 days pregnant. So again, what we're seeing is a statistically significant difference, which suggests that stimulants decrease both birth weight and length of gestation. But what we're not seeing is a clinically significant difference. So for me as a nurse, if I am taking care of a couple babies and one was born at, you know, a few ounces larger than the other one, but both of them are within the normal range, that's not really, that's not relevant to anything about their care or their outcomes. Again, it's the difference between an A and an A minus. Both are excellent grades. You're going to pass. You're going to do just fine in life. And so that's what we typically see with studies of stimulants. Stimulants, you may be aware, have a bad history with science, with interpretation of science, with the press, with our culture in general. You may have heard of the crack baby epidemic from the 1980s. It made headlines for years and sold thousands of papers and made a lot of people clutch a lot of pearls. And then later, when it was disproven and some of the same researchers who caused the problem tried to walk back a little bit, it just didn't make very many headlines. However, it is false. What we see with stimulants is not these, you know, horrible monster babies who are going to be a drain on society. We see really bad outcomes from people who society has left behind. And sometimes those people use stimulants and sometimes they don't, and the outcomes look really similar. We also just keep renewing this frenzy, especially in the media, and I think that's just because it sells. Everybody, regardless of what your political leaning is or who you are, everybody can get behind saving babies from the boogeyman, which is their mothers. If you listen to the media around substance use and pregnancy. And really, it's absurd because babies can't talk, obviously, but I'm a NICU nurse. I specialize in, like, knowing what babies are communicating, even though they're nonverbal. And every baby that I have ever met, all they want in the world is to be with their parent or their mother. Any baby you ask, I don't know what telepathy you can get going, but if you ask a baby what it wants, number one is my mommy. And that's what we're doing. We are setting up this false tension between parents and babies that doesn't exist. In maternal and perinatal care, we're taught to think of the gestational parent and the baby as a dyad, which is one unit consisting of two parts. Neither part can recover from birth and live their best life without the other one. And that is the most healing thing that we can do for these families. And setting them up as adversarial is absurd and unhelpful and frankly arrogant on the part of the medical community. We need to stop it. So our last one is tobacco and nicotine. I will say, although most researchers interpret their findings as related to nicotine, almost all of this research is on cigarette smoking. So we're not looking at people who have gum or inhalers or patches or any of that stuff. If there's any research on that, on those alternative methods and pregnancy, send it my way. I'd love to see it. But everything that I've seen is either about smoking commercially available cigarettes or like spliffs, rollies with tobacco and cannabis combined in one. Now with nicotine, we have some of the most robust and strongest evidence that there is risk for harm. I'm not even going to read this very long list on the slide. There's a lot of stuff that has very strong and well-evidenced associations with nicotine and tobacco smoking. Yet, we as in the healthcare and medical industrial complex, we always like to act like everything that we're doing is based on evidence. So we're punishing people who use opioids or stimulants or cannabis because they're doing danger to their baby. However, when we look at the research, the evidence is really not there for those other substances, and it is there for tobacco and alcohol. And yet, when we have people who use tobacco or smoke cigarettes during their pregnancy, we use harm reduction approaches. It's magical how all of a sudden we know how to do harm reduction. So we ask people if they're ready to quit. If they are, we provide them with resources. We provide them with medications, counseling, all kinds of resources to help people to decrease or stop their use of cigarettes during pregnancy. And that is absolutely the right thing that we should do. I don't want anybody to come away from this with more stigma against people who use cigarettes during their pregnancy because, you know, even though we have all these increased risks, they're all still quite small in the grand scheme of things. You know, if you can represent numbers in various ways. For example, if you have data that shows, you know, kids in the general population had a 1% risk of such and such. If they were exposed to cigarette smoking during pregnancy, they have a 1.5% risk of such and such. So you can say that in a couple different ways. You can say, like I just said, just lay out the numbers. Or you can say children exposed to cigarette smoking have almost doubled risk of blah, blah, blah. And that's what happens because that's what sells and that's what catches people's attention. So I'm by no means saying that we should crack down on tobacco smoking during pregnancy. What I'm saying is that we should provide pregnant people with accurate, evidence-based information and with resources, because I guarantee you most people who are using any substance during pregnancy, but particularly smoking cigarettes, they would rather not, but it's really freaking hard. I've been quitting and restarting smoking for most of my adult life. I think I'm at about 6 times quitting. Just, you know, I got to keep quitting. But it's really hard, and oftentimes at the point that you find out you're pregnant or you're going through some other crisis in your life that makes you interact with systems, it is not necessarily, for most people, the time to make this other really big change that's really difficult. So I don't want us to further stigmatize people who use tobacco. I want us to look at the way we manage that and apply it to the other substances because we know how to do harm reduction. people are always telling me, oh, I don't know how would we even do that? You're already doing it. You just need to take off your blinders and apply the same ideas to tobacco as we do to the other substances, which are much more stigmatized. I kind of already went over all that on the last slide, so I'll call it here and we'll get to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
So really, it's like this idea came to my mind in thinking about, like, you know, well, why is it that harm reduction and reproductive health have never been, it's been so, like, overlooked? You know, it can't be intentional. And, you know, there have been, like, Imani Woods, she was a Black lesbian who was doing outreach with SOS back in the day in Seattle, doing this kind of work that we're talking about now, and was like one of the only people doing it, like, you know, specific to you know, pregnant drug users. But so, you know, I was just thinking about, well, why is it that they've been so separated? And I got to thinking, well, you know, harm reduction has always sort of tried to align itself with evidence to, like, to have legitimacy, like, to prove its worth, like it actually has utility, and it's rooted in science. And so that got me to thinking, well, women have largely been underrepresented in medical literature, like, even how women metabolize different types of drugs, like how we, you know, how they impact our bodies, like how, you know, the hormonal, like hormones, how all of those different things play a role in you know, just even physiological responses compared to our male counterparts. And then when we think about reproductive justice, it's like these two things were happening right about the same time. Like, the harm reduction movement was sort of happening right around that time, and also, like, harm reduction was also kind of born out of, like, the gay rights movement. You know, it was like men who have sex with men were really, like, ACT UP was, like, the large people who were advocating for syringe access, and then you had, like, Black women who were being left behind by white feminism, essentially, and in activist spaces in general, like, activism was really relegated. It was a men's game. Like, you don't really see women participating in grassroots activism. I mean, like, and the feminist movement, first wave feminism, was all white, middle class, pearl clutching ladies. Like, so, so, like, it kind of makes sense. Like, at first I kind of thought, well, it was intentional, that, like, that harm reduction sort of, like, left pregnant and parenting people out. You know, that it was too complicated, or they just, you know, that it was all run by white cis men.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we've been left behind in harm reduction is just, I mean, of course we were, because we were left behind in every other arena of life. Like, people who are pregnant are expected to just kind of bow out. I mean, on some of the forms that I still use in the hospitals, it says on there estimated date of confinement instead of estimated date of birth. It's just, that's the culture that we all, frankly, that's the culture that we all sprang from, where if you were pregnant, you were just expected to stop being an individual and start focusing 100% of your energy on your uterus.
But even in activism.
What was that?
I mean, activism is like, at the union, I'm fucking, every single time I'm adamant about, like, letting, like, childcare be provided, even if I'm the only person there with a kid. You know, it's like activism. It's like we leave parenting people like, we leave them out, and because of that, like, really important things are not brought to the forefront of the attention of, like, and of services or service provision. Like,
so many of the issues that are intersecting in the realm of perinatal harm reduction are issues that other people don't want to touch. Not nobody, but so many different potential allies don't want to be associated with people who use drugs because of stigma and because of bigotry, frankly. And so many people don't want to be associated with advocating for folks experiencing pregnancy and seeking abortion. And so many folks don't want to be connected with anybody who's got a CPS case open, Child Protective Services, or as some of us in the movement like to call it, the family regulation machine. And so I think that there are people who are at their most vulnerable, the most vulnerable people in our society, who have all of these intersecting stigmas placed upon them. Those are the people that get left behind.
I was talking to a reporter from Chicago on Friday. He's writing a story about Measure 110, and we were talking about safe consumption spaces, and it's like, well, like, let's face it, people that are going to be accessing safe consumption spaces aren't the doctors that are doing rails of coke off of, like, the boobs of, like, of topless dancers, at Sassy's. Like, they aren't going to be using that space. It's the people that you described. And the truth of the matter is, this is like, I said the exact same thing, and then we both started to cry because I couldn't realize what came out of my mouth. But what I said was, like, the world has left them behind. I mean, and so what you do is you give them a place to go so that they can feel okay. You know what I mean? And that's like, I don't know, maybe that sounds like hopeless in a way. I don't know, I kind of felt like it sounded like hopeless, but anyways.
I liked it. I think it sounds, I'm going to be a giant nerd here right now, but in Star Trek, in the new Star Trek, there's these ninja nuns, and they're called the Kawat Milat, and they are the champions of lost causes. And so they will go and, stand next to you, even though they know you're going to lose. And I just think that that's really beautiful.
Yeah, because you
don't always lose, but, like, the vast majority of this work is really heartbreaking. But that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be done.
Right, because people still deserve to be loved. Because ultimately, what I'm telling people is to love people. And that's not wrong.
So, what is a doula?
Thanks for talking with me. So weird. So, doulas are people in the context of birth who provide, emotional, physical, information support to people who are pregnant. In my work as a full spectrum doula, that means that I support people regardless of the pregnancy outcome. So I support people who are seeking abortions, I support people who are seeking adoptions, I support people who experience miscarriages, and I also support people who are wanting to parent. So typically, a doula scope of work means that you are visiting parents or pregnant people maybe 2 times in the prenatal period to help them prepare for the birth of the baby and postpartum. You're there with someone throughout labor and delivery to support them throughout that process until baby comes. And then you do a couple of visits postpartum to make sure that, they're adjusting to parenthood well, that feeding needs are met, that you can help them wash dishes and do laundry and cook them a meal. So that's a very traditional doula scope of work. In the work that we do, that looks very, very different. So I call myself a harm reduction doula. I do this work through outreach with the local syringe services program, the People's Harm Reduction Alliance. And as a community outreach worker, in that role, I go into encampments, I go to RVs, I go to people living outside and provide harm reduction services. And through that work, I meet a lot of pregnant people who are using drugs. And so that means I am having prenatal visits in tents. I am meeting people at shelters. And instead of doing, 2 visits, labor and delivery, and then 2 postpartum visits, I'm doing sometimes 50 prenatal visits. I'm with people for days while they have baby. I'm doing a lot of postpartum visits, and I think the content of our visits looks very different as well. So unfortunately, because we don't have good support for people, I'm really doing a lot of case management. I'm like trying to be the glue that's holding together all the services they're accessing if they're accessing other services, but really focusing on critical basic needs like, you know, engaging in WIC or signing up for benefits. Housing is obviously the hugest thing that people need that nobody can get, even though they're pregnant. Trying to get them case managers, trying to get them set up with medical care if that's what they want. And so while typical doulas would really have a pretty limited scope of focus, ours is very broad and very flexible. And we do what people need. I'll bring people food. I'll buy people car seats. I'll buy people cigarettes. Like, what they need is what I'm going to help support them in getting. And that's really identified by them. And so our term of like relationship with folks is very long, and it's very emotional, and it's very personal. And just kind of do what people need, what they say they need.
So let's talk about the word doula.
So the word doula comes from the Greek word for slave, and so there's been a shift in language, and we're being trauma informed to move away from the word doula and use birth workers instead, which actually, like, I think is better because there are all sorts of different doulas, especially in like full spectrum contexts. There's like abortion doulas and end of life doulas, death doulas, whatever. So it's very pointed too because it's specific to birth and people working with those who are giving birth. So birth workers instead of doulas.
Yep, and throughout this presentation, I have used doula, will use doula, because that's the term I'm currently using, but these conversations are absolutely, definitely happening. Birth worker, birth keeper is another phrase that some people identify with that I don't personally use, but thank you, Ria, for that important point.
Okay. So my question kind of is what kind of barriers do you see in place to getting a doula program started? Like, I know you don't have to have certification to practice as a doula, and really anybody can do some of the doula stuff, like the emotional support and being there. But what makes a person a doula?
Yeah, it's a very good question. When I did my doula training, my teacher was like, you were probably a doula long before you knew it. And I think in a lot of ways, harm reductionists are doulas. Like, that's what we do, is we walk alongside people, we witness people, we validate people, and we advocate for people. And those are really like my main duties as a doula and as a harm reduction doula specifically. So I think that there are kind of changing schools of thought about the role of a doula. And I think in the past, it was very much like doulas don't advocate for our clients. We empower our clients. We talk to our clients and they talk to their providers. And for me and in the work that I do, that's not realistic. That's not how I do it, you know. And so, like, as much as I do very much empower my clients, and very much we have lots of conversations around, like, how do you advocate for yourself with providers? What are your rights as a parent and a person who uses drugs and as a human being? Sometimes we have to throw our power and our privilege around to make sure that people get the care that they need. So I think that, like I said, a lot of harm reductionists are already very well suited to doula work. I think the birth stuff and the baby stuff is like something that you can learn and is super important. But I think a lot of people already have the framework that they need to do this work. There are tons of challenges, of course. Many of them are like systemic and institutional. The cost of doula training can be exorbitant. You know, it varies from like $500 to $1,500. Some do offer scholarships, but a lot of times they have really long wait lists. They're hard to access, you know. I think a really big challenge of being a doula who does this work is that even if you do a doula training, very, very, very few of those doula trainings talk about the folks that we serve. There's no conversation about supporting folks who are using drugs during pregnancy. Sometimes the conversation comes up of like supporting people in recovery, but active use is very often not even on the table. So that's a big challenge, and I think as like more states consider Medicaid reimbursement for doula services, that will be a very big topic, because it's relatively easy to, easy to create a reimbursement structure for doulas. I think it's going to be very hard to educate and train up an entire force of doulas who can serve people who use drugs well. I think that's a very different thing. And then lastly, you don't need to have certification to be a doula, but you do, especially for our folks who are often birthing in hospitals, have to have some level of institutional buy-in to allow doulas to engage in that process. So here in Seattle, we're super lucky that a lot of hospitals and providers, I think, have worked with doulas for a long time, recognize the value of doulas, but they at any point can kind of say, you can't be in this room, particularly in the days of COVID where they're really limiting who has access to the hospital. Not having certification makes my status as a doula a little bit more tenuous because a lot of hospitals have put in restrictions around like only certified doulas can access clients at this time, which is terrible. So that's not always the case. That's not the case at every hospital, but I do think that there is still in many places a lack of buy-in for doulas. And there, I think there's even more lack of buy-in for doulas who are really advocating hard for our clients to get the care that they need.
That was perfect. So
did I answer that question?
That was really good. Because, I mean, in one way, I think of being a doula as just the stuff that I do for my siblings when they give birth.
Totally.
You know, plus a lot of, you know, whatever level, honestly, of training and knowledge about birth processes and medications and like all that goes into it. But I think that, like you were kind of saying, that oftentimes the knowledge of the birth stuff is secondary because you are there to be a support for a person primarily. Did you have like anything kind of prepared or in mind that you wanted to talk about, or because I was thinking I could just kind of like move into what it's like providing services for the population that you work with, what it's like to kind of start integrating that into PRA, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's so funny because, you know, it's not a part of PRA still.
Right, but it sort of is.
It
because
is.
There's 3 now.
Totally. Well, so that's what I was kind of thinking about is, you know, as far as what I think I wanted to talk about and what makes this relevant is I think the association between like syringe exchange and in particular outreach-based harm reduction models and doula work is super critical. So I could do this work if I wasn't tied to PRA, but all of the folks that I have met that I'm serving are through the outreach that I do in encampments meeting pregnant people. And I think it's not a coincidence that I am not meeting those people, those pregnant people here at PRA. They're not coming to the table of U districts. They're not coming to the Aurora site. I'm meeting them out in encampments. And sometimes I get like shelter referrals from other providers, but you know, we rarely see pregnant people here at the table. And you've talked about this a lot, but I think that is the case with a lot of harm reduction programs is that folks do not feel safe being visibly pregnant at least and coming into an exchange and asking for the supplies that they need. So I do think that tying harm reduction programs and doula work together makes a lot of sense to kind of support people in their reproductive health needs. But I also think that there needs to be a really thoughtful component of outreach or engagement or finding folks in some other way that is not just expecting people to come to us, because I don't think most harm reduction programs have done a good job of saying, like, this space is for you, you are welcome here, or even thinking about how many of our folks are pregnant. And so I do think that that outreach piece has been really critical, and this work would be, I wouldn't have as many people to support if we weren't really out there talking to people, going to where people live, and offering the support that we do.
Mm-hmm.
I will say something else that we do that is, I think, is definitely unique to what other kind of mainstream doula programs is that in the postpartum period, unfortunately, a huge piece of what we do is advocate and support our families around involvement with child protective services, if you want to call it that, or here in Washington State, the Division of Children, Youth, and Families. And a lot of what we do throughout that process, like we get on the family team decision meetings, we advocate for our clients, we speak to the fact that they love their children, want to be with their children, and just need some support. And very often, almost always, children are still removed. And so a lot of what we do is not drastically changing this really harmful system, but is being with people, walking alongside people, witnessing their pain and validating them and reminding them that they do not deserve this, that they love their kids, that they can be good parents, and that this system is not set up for them to succeed. So I do not want to oversell this to anybody. I do not believe that doulas in and of themselves can change, at least right now, the system that impacts so many pregnant people who use drugs. But I do really want to lift up the value of just seeing our folks and having them be seen and be witnessed, and to have somebody there who gives them support and who sees them as a human within a system that is completely dehumanizing at times. So I think that that is really the value of harm reduction doulas in the postpartum space, when we know there is going to be CPS involvement, is just being a support for people, providing emotional support, and knowing that they have someone in their corner.
Yeah, I want to make sure that people realize the gravity of what it takes to do this. I mean, I'm sure some people listening to this presentation have had cases open against themselves and know how stressful that is, and choosing to walk with somebody through that, and then another person, and then another person over and over. It's a really big commitment, and it also is something that shouldn't be taken lightly, and it also is something that you need a team for. So although we can only offer one free space, ideally what this would turn into is somebody taking the training and then building up their colleagues around them, because this isn't something that can or should be done by just one person. And I know Chelsie talked earlier about, sometimes being with somebody in labor for days. I mean, the shortest hospital stay, I believe, in Washington State, at least it was last time I worked here, for a birth is 24 hours, which is already a lot for one person to do. If there's a prolonged labor, or if there are complications like forceps or C-section or multiples, then that can turn into several days or even a week. So what we're hoping people will take away from this is not just that one person can be that hero or heroine, as it were, but that as a team, all of us in our programs can band together to support our participants and clients and each other in this work, because it is really hard, as Chelsie and I can attest, to be next to somebody in these systems that are just, they're not set up to help. So with that very somber note, please enter into the drawing and start giving the support to these folks, because oftentimes the only thing that we can do better is to be with people during this time. So the time has come. We want to invite you all to enter the drawing for a full spectrum doula training course from Cornerstone Doula Trainings, which is a West Coast, Oakland-based organization. These trainings are really amazing. I know that they have a lot of folks. Nikki Tilgner and Ria also participates as an instructor sometimes. They have a lot of folks with real lived experience and real harm reduction knowledge. So this isn't going to be one of those trainings that Chelsie talked about that doesn't really mention our people. This is going to be truly comprehensive and truly full spectrum. Yeah, we're going to prioritize queer, trans, Black, and Indigenous people of color for getting this free training. So in order to enter, you can tell us a little about yourself if you want to. It may improve your chances of winning, but that's of course optional. You can either email us at info@perinatalharmreduction.org, or you can call and leave a message on my voicemail at 425-241-5243. Just make sure that you let us know how we can contact you in case you won. That's really the only thing that we need in order to do this. And we're going to give you a few days to think about it and get your entries in, and we will hold the drawing on Tuesday, August 31st. So good luck. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this presentation. We hope that it was helpful to you and that it will be able to apply to your work. Please join us in a few moments for the Q&A session afterwards. We're really looking forward to talking with you all. Thanks again.